The law of the spire was absolute, carved into the black heart of the mountain itself. No heir of mixed blood would ever sit the obsidian throne. It was a law written in the ash of forgotten wars, a bulwark against the perceived dilution of their eternity. And King Kaelin, lord of the unseen court, warden of the long night, had stood on the highest parapet and watched it be enforced. He had done nothing. That was the truth that had hollowed him out, leaving a vessel of pure, cold duty that had reigned for 21 years in perfect, agonizing silence. The memory was not a ghost, it was a tenant. It lived in the chill that clung to the tapestries and the way the moonlight, slicing through the tall, arched windows, seemed to catch motes of dust that had been dancing in the air since that very day. He remembered the precise quality of that light, a brittle, winter afternoon sun that offered no warmth, only illumination for the shame of his court. He remembered the sound of the great iron gates grinding shut, a sound of finality that had echoed in every quiet moment since. Ilara had not wept. He had expected tears, pleading, a storm of grief that would have, in some perverse way, absolved him. It would have made her the hysterical human, him the stoic, burdened monarch, and the narrative of his inaction would have been easier to bear. But she had stood straight, her hands resting on the slight, almost imperceptible swell of her belly, and she had looked up at him. Across the vast courtyard, past the sneering faces of his council and the cold iron of the law, her eyes had found his. There was no hatred in them. There was no fear. There was only a profound, devastating disappointment that had struck him with more force than any blade. She had held his gaze until the gates had eclipsed her, and in that moment, she had taken the last of his warmth with her. For 21 years, he had ruled a kingdom of shadows and secrets, his heart a calcified stone in his chest. His council, the architects of his loss, moved around him with the dry rustle of ancient parchment, their faces masks of obsequious reverence that hid their satisfaction. They had what they wanted, a king untainted, a bloodline preserved in its cold purity. They did not see the rot that had set in, the slow decay of a monarch who had traded his soul for his crown. He drank blood not from thirst but from habit, the taste of it as bland as ash on his tongue. He conducted matters of state with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. He was a perfect king, a flawless automaton of tradition and power, and he had never felt more like a fraud. Tonight, the anniversary, was always the worst. The silence in the spire grew teeth. He could hear the echo of her laughter in the empty halls, a sound he had not realized he'd memorized until it was gone. He could feel the phantom weight of her head on his shoulder as he sat on the throne that had cost him everything. He traced the rim of a silver goblet, his long, pale fingers unnaturally still. The wine within was the color of a dying sunset, a vintage from a land that no longer existed, much like the man he had once been. A subtle shift in the air, a disruption of the ancient stillness, heralded an arrival. He did not need to look. Only one being in the spire moved with such apologetic haste. My lord, the voice was thin, reedy. It was Lord Valerus, the keeper of the archives, a creature so old he seemed more dust than vampire. Kaelin did not turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the sliver of moon visible through the window, a scythe of bone in a velvet sky. Valerus. The archives should be your entire world tonight. There is nothing for you here. There was a nervous shuffle of slippered feet on stone. Forgive the intrusion, your majesty. But a word has come. From the borderlands. The borderlands. The term was a euphemism for the wild, untamed territories beyond their shadowed valleys, the patchwork of human settlements they tolerated with dismissive contempt. The place he had sent her. His fingers tightened on the goblet, the silver groaning in protest. I have little interest in the squabbles of mortals. It is not a squabble, my king, Valerus whispered, his voice dropping further, as if the very stones might be listening. It is the scourge. The blighted bloom. The prophecies were not mere folklore. It has taken root in the whisperwood, and the decay spreads toward the human villages along the Serpent's Tooth River. Kaelin felt a coldness that had nothing to do with his nature. The blighted bloom was a legend, a horror story told to young vampires to ensure their obedience. A parasitic corruption that fed not on blood, but on life magic itself, turning vibrant land to grey dust and living creatures to withered husks. It was said that it could even poison the undying, causing a slow, agonizing dissolution into nothingness. That is impossible. The bloom was eradicated during the sundering. The last of its seed was sealed away, Valerus corrected, his voice trembling. Sealed in a vault that could only be opened by one of the royal line. But the seal was imperfect. It required a unique resonance. Not just the blood of the throne, but blood of the throne mingled with the fading sun. The life of the mortal world. The goblet in Kaelin's hand shattered. Silver shards and dark red wine sprayed across the stone floor, a splash of sudden, shocking violence in the monastic quiet. He did not feel the cuts on his palm. He felt only the icy pull of dread, a premonition so sharp it was like swallowing glass. Blood of the throne mingled with the fading sun, he repeated, the words tasting like poison. A Dampier. A half-blood. Valerus flinched but held his ground. The prophecies say the corruption can only be purged by the same power that could unleash it. A child of both worlds. An heir of the spire, and of humanity. Kaelin slowly rose from his throne, the movement fluid and terrible. He was a statue of white marble brought to awful life, his eyes burning with a cold, black fire. The council had exiled his son to protect the purity of the throne. And in doing so, they had unleashed a plague that could destroy it entirely. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. For 21 years, he had honored their law, their tradition. He had sacrificed his heart on the altar of their prejudice. And now, that same prejudice threatened to consume them all. He looked down at his hand. The wounds were already closing, the silver expelling itself from his immortal flesh. But the stain remained. He had stood by while they exiled her, carrying his unborn child, his heir. And now, the world itself was demanding he answer for that sin. He had to find him. He had to go to the one place he had sworn never to return, to face the woman whose disappointment had been his constant companion for 2 decades. He had to find the son who, by now, would surely call another man father. The silence of the throne room was finally broken by the sound of his own voice, a low, dangerous whisper that was a promise and a curse. Prepare my horse. The village of Oak Haven smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and baking bread. It was a scent Lara had come to associate with peace, a simple, profound contentment that had taken her years to cultivate from the ashes of her old life. She stood on the small porch of her cottage, a basket of herbs in her hand, and watched the evening mist roll down from the pine-clad slopes of the Serpent's Tooth Mountains. The air was cool, carrying the promise of rain, and the first lamps were beginning to glow in the windows of the neighboring homes, warm and golden against the deepening twilight. This life was a fortress she had built, stone by painful stone. A heavy, rhythmic thudding echoed from the workshop beside the cottage, the sound of a hammer striking hot iron. It was the heartbeat of her new world, the sound of Liam at his forge. He was a man made of the same quiet strength as the mountains that surrounded them, his presence as solid and reassuring as the oak trees that gave the village its name. He had found her 21 years ago, a wraith of a woman with haunted eyes and a fierce, protective hand on her belly, and he had asked no questions. He had simply offered her a bowl of stew and a place by his fire. He had offered her safety. Mother! A voice, rich and deep, pulled her from her reverie. She turned, a smile touching her lips before she was even fully aware of it. Rhys stood in the doorway, ducking his head slightly to clear the frame. He had her eyes, a deep, contemplative brown, but he had a height and breadth of shoulder that was entirely his own, or so she had always told him. He was the sun and moon of her existence, the reason she had found the strength to survive. He was her son. The stew is ready, he said, his own smile mirroring hers. And Liam says if he hammers that plowshare one more time, it's going to be thin as a leaf. She laughed, a genuine, unfettered sound. Then we'd better rescue him. Your appetite alone could drain the village stores. She followed him inside, into the warmth of the small, cluttered room that served as their kitchen and living space. A large wooden table dominated the center, scarred with the marks of 2 decades of meals, conversations, and life. Liam was already there, washing the soot from his hands and face in a basin of water. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face crinkling at the corners of his eyes. He was not a young man, his hair more silver than brown, but his arms were thick with the corded muscle of his trade, and his gaze was as clear and steady as a mountain stream. He looked at Rhys, then at Elara, and the love in that look was a tangible thing, a shield against the world. "Just in time," he rumbled, his voice a low, comforting bass. "Another minute and I'd have been hammering my own thumb for dinner." Rhys grinned and began to ladle the thick, savory stew into wooden bowls. They ate as they always did, in comfortable silence punctuated by easy conversation about the day's events: a new foal born in the lower pasture, a leaky roof on the miller's cottage, the prospects for the autumn harvest. This was the fabric of their lives, woven from small, ordinary moments of shared existence. It was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had fought to protect. But for the past few days, a thread of unease had been pulled taut within her. A strange stillness had fallen over the whisperwood at the edge of the valley. The birds had gone silent, and the hunters who ventured near its borders returned with stories of a creeping grayness, of trees that seemed to wither overnight, their leaves turning to dust on the branch. A chill had settled in the air that had nothing to do with the coming season, a deep, unnatural cold that reminded her of polished stone and eternal night. She felt a familiar dread coiling in her stomach, the instinctive fear of a hunted thing that senses the predator's return. As if summoned by her thoughts, a sudden commotion erupted from the village square. Shouts, a woman's scream, the panicked barking of dogs. Liam was on his feet in an instant, a hand reaching for the wood axe that always leaned by the door. Rhys stood beside him, his young face set in a grim, protective mask. "Stay here," Liam commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. But Elara was already moving toward the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She peered through the small, leaded pane of glass, her breath misting the surface. The villagers were scattering, running for the shelter of their homes, their faces pale with terror. They were fleeing from a single figure in the center of the square. A man on a horse. The horse was a creature of nightmare, black as coal and unnaturally still, its eyes glowing like embers. But it was the rider that made her blood run cold. He was tall and unnaturally graceful, clad in dark, impeccably tailored riding clothes that seemed to absorb the twilight. He dismounted with a fluid ease that was both elegant and predatory. He did not look at the fleeing villagers. His head turned slowly, methodically, as if scanning for something, for someone. And then, his gaze locked onto her cottage. Onto her window. Onto her. 21 years vanished in a heartbeat. She was standing in the cold courtyard of the spire again, the weight of 1,000 hostile eyes upon her. The face was the same, untouched by time, as if carved from pale, perfect marble. The high cheekbones, the straight, aristocratic nose, the mouth that could be both cruel and tender. And the eyes. The eyes were black pits of ancient sorrow and unending night. It was Kaelin. "Elara?" Liam's voice was sharp with concern at her side. He followed her gaze and let out a low curse. "By the gods!" Rhys moved to stand beside her, his body a solid, warm shield. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and defiance. Elara could not answer. The words were trapped in her throat, strangled by a tidal wave of emotions she had thought long buried, grief, rage, and a terrible, treacherous echo of love. He had come. After all this time, the ghost had walked out of her memories and into her world, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he had not come for her. He had come for their son. The fortress she had built was about to be besieged, not by an army, but by a single, devastating memory made flesh. Kaelin dismounted, the soft thud of his boots on the packed earth the only sound in the suddenly silent village square. The air was thick with the mortal's fear, a scent as cloying and pungent as overripe fruit. It was a familiar smell, one he had commanded and controlled for centuries, but tonight it felt different. It felt like an accusation. He ignored the shuttered windows and barred doors, the terrified eyes peering through the cracks. His attention was fixed on the small, sturdy cottage at the edge of the woods, a plume of smoke curling from its stone chimney like a defiant banner. He could feel her presence inside, a flicker of warmth in the cold landscape of his senses, a beacon he had navigated by even when he pretended to be lost. Then he saw her. A face in the window, pale and stark against the glass. The years had been kind to her, and they had been cruel. They had etched fine lines around her eyes, but they were lines of laughter and worry, not of bitterness. They had threaded silver into her dark hair, but it only seemed to accentuate the fierce intelligence in her gaze. She was no longer the girl he had fallen in love with, the one who had seen past the monster to the man. She was a woman who had survived him. The realization was a physical blow, more potent than any weapon. And then, another figure appeared at the window beside her. A young man, tall and broad, standing with a protective solidity that was achingly familiar. He had Alara's dark hair and her determined chin, but the set of his shoulders, the height, the coiled strength in his posture, that was his. Kaelin's breath, a thing he no longer needed, hitched in his chest. This was his son. A living, breathing person, not a theoretical heir or a whispered prophecy, but a man grown. A man who was staring at him with open hostility, his hand resting on the hilt of a sheathed knife at his belt. In that moment, Kaelin understood the vast, immeasurable chasm of the years he had lost. He was not seeing a son, he was seeing a stranger. A man joined them at the window, older, weathered, his arm moving to rest protectively around Alara's shoulders. The blacksmith. Liam. Kaelin could smell the lingering scent of coal smoke and honest sweat on him, the scent of a life lived in daylight. He watched the man murmur something to Alara, his expression one of fierce, gentle concern. He watched as Rhys leaned in, the three of them a tableau of familial unity, a fortress of light against the darkness he represented. And the man Rhys called father was not him. The pain of it was a novel sensation. He had known grief, regret, loneliness, cold, passive emotions that had settled into his bones like a permanent winter. This was different. This was an active, searing agony. It was jealousy. It was the raw, visceral fury of a king who had everything and nothing. He had a throne of obsidian and a kingdom of shadows, and this mortal man, this blacksmith, had a home. He took a step toward the cottage, and the door opened. It was not the man or the boy who emerged, but Alara. She walked out onto the small porch, her back straight, her chin high. She carried no weapon, but her entire being was a shield. She had not changed. She had never needed a sword to be dangerous. Kaelin, she said. Her voice was not the soft melody he remembered. It was lower, stronger, honed to a fine edge by years of hardship. It was the voice of a survivor, and it cut him more deeply than any scream could have. Alara, he responded, the name feeling foreign and sacred on his tongue. He had not spoken it aloud in 21 years. They stood there, separated by a dozen yards of muddy earth and 2 decades of silence. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. He could feel the weight of what he needed to say, the monumental task of explaining the unexplainable, of asking for the unforgivable. He needed to speak of prophecies and plagues, of a danger that threatened to consume her world and his. But all he could think was, I never stopped loving you. The thought was so loud in his mind, so utterly useless and destructive, that he could not speak at all. Why are you here? She asked, her voice devoid of warmth. It was a demand, not a question. There is a danger, he began, his own voice sounding hollow and formal to his ears. A corruption spreading from the whisperwood. It threatens everyone, mortal and otherwise. I have come because I need help. Her laugh was a short, sharp, bitter sound. Help. You, the king of the spire, need help from a village of farmers and blacksmiths. Your armies have grown weary, have they? It is not a matter for armies, he said, forcing himself to hold her gaze, to endure the judgment in it. It is a matter of blood. He saw the flicker of understanding, and the immediate, visceral fear that followed it, cross her face. Her hand instinctively went to the doorframe, as if to brace herself. No, she whispered, the word a plea and a command. From behind her, Rhys stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand slightly in front of his mother. He was taller than Kaelin had realized, his youth radiating a defiant energy that was purely human. Whatever you want, you're not getting it here. Leave, the boy said, his voice cracking only slightly on the last word. Kaelin looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not just a stranger, but a good man. A young man raised with love and honor, taught to protect his home and his family. A man raised by another father. The irony was suffocating. He had come to save his kingdom, but the first casualty of his arrival was clearly going to be this boy's world. Your mother and I need to speak, he said, his voice softer than he intended. Alone. Anything you have to say to her, you can say to me, Rhys countered, his hand tightening on his knife. Elara placed a hand on her son's arm. Rhys, go inside. You too, Liam. Her voice was quiet, but it held an authority none of them could deny. Liam hesitated, his eyes locked on Kaelin, a silent promise of violence if any harm came to her. Rhys looked from his mother to the imposing stranger, his face a storm of confusion and anger. Mother, I'm not leaving you alone with him. Go inside, she repeated, her gaze unwavering. This is a conversation 21 years in the making. It is long overdue. Reluctantly, the two men retreated back into the cottage, though Kaelin knew they were just behind the door, listening, waiting. Now they were truly alone, two ghosts from another life meeting in the twilight. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and ancient pain. She would not make this easy for him. She would not offer him a single crack in her armor to exploit. He would have to be the one to break the silence, to reopen the wound he had created. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood at the foot of the small wooden steps that led to her porch. He could see her more clearly now, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. She was afraid, but she would die before she let him see it. He is a fine young man, Elara, Kaelin said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. Her eyes flashed with a cold fire. He is. No thanks to you. The words struck home, a clean, precise blow. You have no right to be here. No right to speak his name. No right to even look at him. You gave up that right on the day you chose your throne over your son. It was not a choice, he said, the old, hollow excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. It was the law. It was cowardice, she shot back, her voice shaking with repressed fury. You are a king. You command legions. You make the sun fear to rise. Do not stand in my home and tell me you were powerless. You were a coward, Kaelin. You stood on your parapet and you watched. You watched them throw me out like refuse, and you did nothing. He had no defense, because she was right. Every word was the unvarnished truth. He had stood there, a king in name, a prisoner in fact, and he had let his fear of his own counsel, of his own history, dictate his fate. And hers. And their sons. I have lived with that choice every day for 21 years, he said quietly, offering the only truth he had left. There has not been a moment of peace. Not 1 inch. Good, she said, her voice like ice. You don't deserve peace. She turned, her hand reaching for the latch on the door. The danger you speak of, it's his problem, isn't it? That's why you're here. The law you hid behind now requires the very thing you cast away. He could only nod, the movement stiff and formal. She paused, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. I will not let you destroy him, Kaelin. I built this life to keep him safe from you, from your world. I will not let you tear it down to save a kingdom that was not worth saving. She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind her. The click of the latch was as final and as absolute as the grinding of the spire's gates all those years ago. He was left alone in the encroaching darkness, the chill of the mountain air a pale imitation of the cold that now gripped his heart. He had crossed the world to find his son, only to be barred by a simple wooden door, held shut by the woman who had every right to hate him. The inside of the cottage felt small, suffocating. The air, usually thick with the comforting scents of stew and wood smoke, now crackled with a tension that was almost unbearable. Rhys stood with his back pressed against the far wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His world had been stable, solid, rooted in the love of his parents and the rhythms of the village. Now, the ground had dissolved beneath his feet. The stranger outside, the king his mother had named with such venom, had looked at him with an intensity that had felt like being branded. Liam was by the hearth, his big hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was watching Elara, his expression a mixture of profound worry and a deep, aching sadness. He knew. Rhys realized with a jolt that Liam had always known, or had at least suspected, that there was more to their past than Elara had ever said. He had never pressed, never demanded the truths she held so close. He had simply loved her, and loved the son she brought with her. Ilara leaned against the closed door as if to physically hold the outside world at bay. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. She looked older than she had just an hour before, the weight of the past settling upon her like a shroud. "Mother," Rhys said, his voice quiet but insistent. "Who is he?" She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with an angry gesture. "He is a mistake I made a long time ago." "He's more than that," Rhys pressed, taking a step forward. "The way he looked at me. The way you looked at him. He's the reason we're here, isn't he? The reason you never talk about where you came from." Ilara pushed herself away from the door and walked to the table, her movements stiff. She sank onto a bench, her hands flat on the scarred wood. "His name is Kaelin. He is the ruler of a kingdom far from here. A place of stone and shadow." "And?" Rhys prompted, his patience fraying. Liam moved then, crossing the room to stand behind Ilara, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered his hand with her own, a small gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. It was Liam who spoke next, his voice a low rumble. "And he is your father, Rhys." The words dropped into the silence of the room like stones into a deep well. Rhys felt the impact in the pit of his stomach, a sickening lurch as his entire reality fractured. Father. His father was Liam. His father was the man who had taught him how to shoe a horse, how to read, how to be a good man. His father was the steady, warm presence that had been the bedrock of his life. This creature outside, this cold, marble king with eyes like black ice, he was a monster from a child's nightmare, not a father. "No," Rhys said, shaking his head, a desperate denial. He looked at Liam, his eyes pleading. "That's not true." Liam's expression was full of pain, but his gaze was steady. "I am the man who raised you, son. And I will always be your father. But he is your blood." Rhys turned his gaze back to his mother, a storm of betrayal and confusion raging within him. "You lied to me. My whole life, you lied to me." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Ilara flinched as if he had struck her. "I didn't lie," she said, her voice trembling. "I protected you. I chose a life for you where you could be safe, where you could be happy. A life away from him and his world. His world, it chews up good things, Rhys. It would have destroyed you. And you didn't think I had a right to know," he demanded, his voice rising. "To know that what am I? What does that make me?" He felt a strange thrumming under his skin, an energy he had always attributed to youthful restlessness, but which now felt alien and frightening. It was then that Kaelin chose to speak, his voice coming through the thick wooden door, unnaturally clear and resonant, as if he were standing in the room with them. "It makes you the only one who can stop the plague that is coming for this village." Rhys spun toward the door, his hand flying to the hilt of his knife. "Get away from our home." "I will not," Kaelin's voice replied, calm and implacable. "Not until you understand what is at stake. The blighted bloom that withers the whisperwood feeds on life. It will not stop at the edge of the forest. It will crawl into your fields, poison your streams, and wither every living thing in this valley, including every person you have ever known." "Lies," Ilara cried, rising to her feet. "Tricks to get what you want. Is it a lie that the animals have fled the woods?" Kaelin's voice pressed on, relentless. "That the hunters return with empty hands and pale faces? That there is a creeping cold that has nothing to do with winter? You have felt it. You all have. The corruption was sealed away long ago, and the lock was keyed to a specific bloodline. To my bloodline. But it required a catalyst to open. A touch of the mortal world. Blood of the throne, mingled with the fading sun." Rhys looked at his own hands, suddenly feeling like they belonged to someone else. "A child of both worlds." The words echoed in the suffocating silence of the cottage. "The seal is broken," Kaelin continued from outside. "Because of you. Your very existence, your unique nature, has undone an ancient magic. It was an accident. A consequence none could have foreseen. But it changes nothing. The same power that unleashed it is the only power that can contain it. Your power, Rhys." Rhys felt dizzy, the room tilting around him. He leaned back against the wall, his head spinning. He was the cause of this plague. This curse. His life, the secret his mother had kept to protect him, was the very thing that now endangered everyone he loved. The irony was a bitter pill. He looked at Liam, the man he called father, his face etched with worry. He looked at his mother, her expression one of pure terror, not for herself, but for him. And he thought of the people in the village, the families he had known his entire life. He thought of them withering, turning to dust, because of him. He pushed himself off the wall and strode to the door. Ilara grabbed his arm. "Rhys, no. Don't listen to him. We'll find another way." "What other way?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Run. Hide. Let everyone here die while we save ourselves. Is that what you've been doing all these years? Running?" The barb hit its mark. Ilara recoiled, her hand falling from his arm. The hurt in her eyes was a physical pain in his own chest, but he couldn't stop. The foundations of his life had been ripped out from under him, and he was lashing out at the only person he could. He threw the door open. Kaelin stood there, a dark statue against the last vestiges of twilight. He had not moved an inch. His black eyes were fixed on Rhys, and for the first time, Rhys saw something beyond cold authority in them. He saw a flicker of desperation, of a pain so old and deep it was part of the man himself. "You will prove it," Rhys said, his voice hard as iron, echoing the trade of the man who had raised him. "You will show me this plague. You will prove that I am what you say I am. And if you are telling the truth, you will teach me how to stop it." Kaelin gave a slow, solemn nod. "I will. But know this," Rhys continued, stepping out onto the porch to stand face to face with his biological father, a king of shadows. "I am not doing this for you. Or for your kingdom. I am doing this for my home. For my family." He glanced back over his shoulder, at the sturdy, heartbroken blacksmith and the terrified, defiant woman in the doorway. "And you are not my family." The weight of Rhys's words settled between them, a declaration of allegiance that drew a clear, painful line in the dirt. Kaelin accepted it with a quiet inclination of his head. He had expected no less. To this boy, he was not a father, he was a portent of doom, a harbinger of a terrible truth that had just shattered a young man's life. Duty, cold and familiar, was all he had to offer. "The decay is most advanced at the heart of the Whisperwood," Kaelin said, his tone shifting to that of a commander outlining a campaign. "There is a clearing where an ancient waystone stands. That is the epicenter. The bloom feeds on the magic that flows through the stone, poisoning the ley lines that nourish the valley. We must go there. At dawn." "No," Ilara's voice cut through the night air, sharp and absolute. She stepped out of the cottage, positioning herself between Rhys and Kaelin, a lioness shielding her cub, even if that cub now stood taller than her. "You are not taking him into that wood alone." Kaelin's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it rested on her. "Ilara, this is not a place for mortals." "He is mortal," she shot back fiercely. "He is more mortal than he is yours. And I will not have you filling his head with the darkness of your world without me there to temper it." Liam appeared in the doorway behind her, his large frame filling the space. "She is not going alone," either his statement was flat, non-negotiable, his eyes fixed on Kaelin with a look of pure, unadulterated challenge. A long, tense moment passed. Kaelin, the ancient king, found himself facing a united front of mortal defiance. A blacksmith, a healer, and the son they had raised together. He felt a strange, unwelcome pang of something that might have been admiration. They were protecting each other. They were a family. "Very well," he conceded. "But you will do exactly as I say. Your lives will depend on it." The journey into the Whisperwood at dawn was a descent into a dying world. The outer trees still held some semblance of life, but the farther they walked, the more the forest transformed. The vibrant green of moss and fern gave way to a sickly, uniform grey. The air grew cold and thin, smelling of dust and decay. The normal sounds of the woods, the chatter of squirrels, the call of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, were gone, replaced by an oppressive, unnatural silence. It was a silence that felt like listening to a corpse. Rhys walked with Kaelin at the front, Ilara and Liam a few paces behind. The young man was a storm of conflicting emotions. He was terrified, angry, and deeply confused. He kept glancing at his hands, half expecting to see them change, to see some outward sign of the monstrous heritage that flowed through his veins. He felt Kaelin's presence beside him not as a comfort, but as a constant, unnerving reminder of his fractured identity. Kaelin, for his part, was clumsy in his new role. He was a king, used to giving orders and receiving immediate, unquestioning obedience. He knew how to command armies, not how to reassure a son he had just met. He pointed out the signs of the Blight's passage with a detached, clinical precision. "You see how the bark on this oak peels away," he said, his long fingers gesturing toward a great, dying tree. "The bloom starves it from the inside, drawing the life out through the roots. It is a parasite of immense power." Rhys just grunted in response, his eyes scanning the deadfall around them. He was looking for a threat he could understand, something he could fight with the knife at his belt or the axe on his back. This slow, creeping death felt insidious, impossible to combat. "What am I supposed to do?" Rhys finally asked, the frustration evident in his voice. "Sing to the trees until they feel better?" A faint, humorless smile touched Kaelin's lips. "Not quite. The energy that flows from the waystone, you should be able to feel it. A vibration. A wrongness. Your blood will recognize it. You must learn to focus your will, to pull on the life within you, the human part, and project it outwards. Counter the decay with vitality. Focus my will," Rhys repeated flatly. "You make it sound so simple." "It is the most difficult thing you will ever do," Kaelin replied, his voice losing its professorial tone and becoming something more personal, more somber. "To command the life within you requires accepting all of what you are. The sun and the shadow. The warmth and the cold." Behind them, Ilara watched the exchange with a hawk's intensity. Every word from Kaelin's lips felt like a subtle poison, seeping into her son's mind. She saw Rhys's confusion, his struggle, and her heart ached with a fierce, protective rage. This was what she had feared, Kaelin reshaping her son, turning him into one of his dark, brooding kind. Liam walked beside her, his hand resting on the handle of his axe, his steady presence a silent reassurance. He did not understand the magic or the prophecies, but he understood danger, and he understood his duty to protect his family. They finally reached the clearing. It was a scene of profound desolation. The grass was a carpet of grey dust, and the surrounding trees were skeletal claws reaching for a sky the color of lead. In the center stood the waystone, a tall, slender monolith of black rock that seemed to absorb what little light there was. It was covered in pulsing, sickly violet veins that writhed like living things. The air here was freezing, and it hummed with a low, dissonant frequency that made Rhys's teeth ache. "This is it," Kaelin said, his voice low. "The heart of the scourge." The wrongness of the place was overwhelming. Rhys felt it in his bones, a deep, nauseating thrum that seemed to resonate with something inside him. It felt like a discordant note in the song of the world, and it called to a similar discordance within himself. "I feel it," he breathed, a hand going to his chest. "Good," Kaelin said. "Now, listen to me carefully. The bloom will have a guardian. A manifestation of its corrupting power. It will be drawn to the strongest source of life in this place, you." As if on cue, the ground near the base of the waystone began to tremble. The grey dust swirled, and from it rose a figure. It was vaguely humanoid, formed from twisted, blighted roots and grey, dead wood. It had no face, only a knot of pulsing violet light where its head should be. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its branch-like arms ending in sharp, splintered points. Liam immediately stepped forward, placing himself in front of Ilara and raising his axe. "Get behind me." But the creature ignored him. It ignored them all. Its focus was entirely on Rhys. It let out a sound like the cracking of ancient trees and began to shamble toward him. "Do not fight it with steel," Kaelin warned, his hand on Rhys's shoulder. "It will drain the life from anything it touches. You must fight it with what you are. Reach inside, find that warmth, the part of you that is your mother's son. The part that loves the sun. Pull it to the surface." Rhys stared at the approaching horror, his mind blank with panic. He was a blacksmith's boy. He knew iron and fire and sweat. He didn't know how to fight with feelings. He drew his knife, the familiar weight a small comfort in his hand. The root creature lunged. Kaelin moved with impossible speed, a black blur that intercepted the creature, shoving it back with a force that should have shattered it. But the creature simply reformed, its pulpy, wooden flesh reknitting instantly. Kaelin hissed as he drew his hand back. Where the creature had touched him, his skin was grey and withered, the flesh smoking slightly. The wound began to heal, but slowly, sluggishly. It feeds on me as well, Kaelin gritted out, his face pale. Rhys, you must. Seeing Kaelin hurt, seeing the proof of the danger, jolted Rhys from his fear. He looked at his mother, her face a mask of terror. He looked at Liam, standing ready to die for him. He was not a king's son. He was their son. And he would not let this thing touch them. He closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of the monster. He ignored the cold thrum of the waystone and tried to do as Kaelin said. He reached inside himself. He thought of the warmth of the forge on a winter's day. He thought of the smell of his mother's baking, of the reassuring weight of Liam's hand on his shoulder. He thought of the sun on his face, the taste of clean water from the mountain stream, the feeling of rich earth in his hands. He gathered up all the simple, good, living things that made up his life. He gathered up his love for his family, for his home. He felt a warmth begin to pool in his chest, a small, defiant flicker against the encroaching cold. He nurtured it, focused on it, let it grow. He opened his eyes. The creature was almost upon him. He held out his hands, palms forward, and pushed. It wasn't a physical push. He pushed with that feeling, that warmth, that life. A wave of pale, golden light erupted from his hands, so bright it made everyone flinch. It wasn't a violent blast, but a gentle, inexorable wave of pure vitality. When the light struck the root creature, it didn't explode. It stopped. The writhing violet veins on its body flickered and died. The dead wood of its form seemed to soften. Tiny green shoots began to sprout from its arms, and a single white flower bloomed where its face had been. Then, with a soft sigh, it collapsed into a pile of rich, dark loam. Rhys stared, panting, at his hands. They were glowing with a faint, residual light. He had done it. He had fought death with life. He looked up at Kaelin. The ancient vampire was staring at him, and for the first time, his mask of stoic control was gone. In his eyes was a look of raw, unadulterated awe. And pride. A father's pride. The sight was more shocking to Rhys than the monster had been. The truce they had forged was as fragile as a winter leaf. After the encounter in the woods, a new, tense dynamic settled over the small cottage. Kaelin did not return to the spire. He took up residence in the village's dilapidated, long-abandoned mill, a stone structure by the cold, fast-flowing river. It suited him, Ilara thought bitterly. A place of grinding and dust, isolated from the warmth of the village hearths. But his presence remained, a constant, oppressive weight on the entire community. The villagers gave the mill a wide berth, whispering stories of the Dark Lord who had come to their valley, their fear a palpable thing that clung to the evening mist. Inside the cottage, the silence was heavier than before. Rhys was changed. The revelation of his parentage and the discovery of his power had driven a wedge of quiet introspection between him and the world. He spent hours by himself, walking the perimeter of the valley, or simply sitting and staring at his hands as if they were foreign objects. He was trying to reconcile the boy who shod horses with the boy who could make flowers bloom from dead wood. Kaelin attempted to bridge the chasm between them, but his efforts were clumsy, born of centuries of solitude and command. He would appear at the edge of the forge's light while Rhys and Liam worked, a silent, dark figure observing from the shadows. He didn't speak, he just watched, his gaze intense. It was meant, perhaps, as a gesture of interest, but it felt like scrutiny. Rhys would grow tense, his hammer strikes becoming more forceful, more erratic, until Liam would quietly suggest they stop for the day. One evening, Kaelin brought a gift. It was a book, bound in dark, supple leather and filled with elegant, hand-drawn script. He presented it to Rhys with a stiff formality. These are the histories of our line. The legends of the firstborn. It is your right to know them. Rhys took the book, his fingers tracing the silver sigil on the cover, a stylized bat with its wings encircling a teardrop. He didn't open it. He simply held it, the weight of 1,000 years of shadow and blood in his hands. The man who raised me taught me to read using farmers' almanacs and books of local law, Rhys said, his voice flat. He looked up, his eyes meeting Kaelin's. I'm not sure I have much interest in the history of kings. He placed the book on a shelf, unopened, a silent rejection that was more potent than any angry outburst. Kaelin's face remained impassive, but Ilara, watching from the doorway, saw the flicker of pain in his eyes before it was extinguished. She felt a frustrating, unwelcome pang of sympathy. He was trying, in his own cold, regal way. But he did not know how to be a father. He only knew how to be a king. The heart of the new family dynamic was the quiet, unyielding presence of Liam. He did not try to compete with the Vampire King. He did not need to. His fatherhood was not built on blood or power, but on 21 years of unwavering love and support. He saw Rhys's turmoil, and he did not offer advice on magic or destiny. He offered stability. The fence by the north pasture needs mending, he said one morning, handing Rhys a mallet and a leather pouch of iron spikes. Could use your eye. Mine aren't what they used to be for finding a straight line. They worked for hours under the pale autumn sun, the simple, repetitive labor a balm for Rhys's troubled mind. They didn't speak of kings or curses. They spoke of the weather, of the sick ewe in Goodman Gable's flock, of the best way to brace a corner post. As they worked, Rhys felt the coiled tension in his shoulders begin to unwind. This was real. The solid weight of the mallet, the smell of the damp earth, the quiet companionship of the man who had always been his father. This was his truth. He watches you, Liam said, not looking up from the post he was setting. The king. I know, Rhys replied, hammering a spike into place with a clean, sharp blow. He doesn't know what to do, Liam continued, his voice a low rumble. A man like that, power is all he's ever had. He probably thinks he can command you to love him, the same way he commands the sun to set. Rhys paused, leaning on his mallet. I don't hate him. The admission surprised him. I think I want to. It would be easier. But I just feel nothing. He's a stranger. Liam finally looked up, his gaze clear and kind. He is. And you don't owe him anything, Rhys. Not your loyalty, not your forgiveness, not your love. The only thing you owe is to yourself. To be a good man. And you already are. 1 inch. He clapped Rhys on the shoulder, a solid, reassuring gesture. Now, that post is still crooked. Ilara, too, was struggling. Having Kaelin so close was a constant, agonizing reminder of the life she had lost and the love she had buried. She found herself watching him from her window as he stood by the river, a solitary figure staring into the churning water as if seeking answers. She remembered a younger man, one who had laughed, who had brought her wildflowers from the high mountain slopes where no human could tread, who had read her poetry in a voice like velvet and thunder. Where had that man gone? Had he ever truly existed, or had he been a fantasy she had projected onto a beautiful monster? One night, unable to sleep, she walked out to the small herb garden behind the cottage. The air was cold, and the moon was a sliver of silver in the sky. She was not surprised to find him there, standing by the low stone wall at the edge of her property. You should not be here, she said, her voice quiet in the night. He turned to face her. In the dim light, he looked less like a king and more like a ghost. I could not rest. A common affliction among the living, she said, the barb subtle but sharp. He ignored it. I saw the book, he said. He has not opened it. He is not your subject, Kaelin. He is not required to study the history of his conqueror. I am not trying to conquer him, he said, and for the first time, she heard a note of raw frustration in his voice. I am trying to understand him. Understanding is not a birthright, she replied, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It is earned. You have 21 years of work to do. You cannot accomplish it in a week with a single leather-bound book. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl filling the space between them. He is more your son than mine, Kaelin said finally, his voice barely a whisper. He has your strength. Your light. He has Liam's kindness, she countered softly. He has the decency of a man who was taught his worth is in his actions, not his blood. Kaelin flinched, but he did not argue the point. He looked past her, at the warm, golden light spilling from the cottage window, a beacon of the life she had built without him. You did well, Elara, he said, the admission sounding like it was physically painful for him to make. You gave him a good life. A better one than I ever could have. It was the closest he had ever come to an apology. It was not enough, not nearly enough to heal the wound he had left in her soul, but it was a start. A fragile, tentative step onto the broken bridge between their two worlds. She gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that was neither forgiveness nor acceptance, but simply truth. Then she turned and walked back to the warmth of her home, leaving him alone in the cold moonlight. The preparations for the final confrontation were a grim, quiet affair. Kaelin explained that destroying the Guardian had only been a temporary solution. The blighted bloom was rooted in the waystone itself, drawing power from the corrupted ley lines. To cleanse it, Rhys would have to go back to the clearing and pour his own life energy directly into the stone, overwriting the corruption with his unique blend of human vitality and immortal permanence. It was a dangerous, delicate process. If he gave too much, it could kill him. If he gave too little, the bloom would consume him, twisting his power to its own ends and becoming unstoppable. They needed to protect him while he worked. The bloom would not give up its hold easily. It would manifest more guardians, likely more powerful than the first. Kaelin would be the primary defender, his speed and strength the best defense against the physical manifestations. But his power was diminished by the Blight's aura, and he could not hold them off alone. This was where Liam came in. He could not fight with magic, but he could fight. He spent 2 days at his forge, not shoeing horses or mending plows, but crafting weapons. He fashioned a short, heavy-bladed sword for Rhys, its balance perfect in the young man's hand. For himself, he honed his wood axe to a razor's edge. But his masterwork was for Elara. He took the head of an old billhook, reforged it, and mounted it on a sturdy ash pole, creating a vicious-looking polearm. You know how to use a staff to herd sheep, he said, pressing it into her hands. This is the same. Just keep the pointy end facing the monsters. His attempt at humor did little to ease the tension in her shoulders, but she gripped the weapon, its solid weight a small comfort. The day they were to set out, a cold rain began to fall, slicking the dead leaves and turning the path into the Whisperwood into a treacherous, muddy track. The 4 of them walked in silence, a strange, grim procession. A vampire king, a village healer, a blacksmith, and the boy who was all and none of them. As they drew closer to the corrupted heart of the woods, they found Kaelin and Elara falling into an old, forgotten rhythm. He would point out a treacherous patch of ground, she would spot a cluster of night-blooming moonpetal, a key ingredient for a poultice that could soothe the Blight's touch. Their shared knowledge, one of ancient dangers, the other of the living world's remedies, began to weave together. The air here is thin, Kaelin noted as they entered a grove of skeletal silver birches. The Blight leeches the very essence of it. Breathe shallowly. A few moments later, Elara stopped, pointing with her polearm. Thornwood. The sap is a mild paralytic. If the Guardians are made of wood, a coating of this on your blades might slow their regeneration. They worked together, Kaelin using a silver dagger to score the bark, Elara collecting the thick, viscous sap in a small clay pot. For a few minutes, they were not a king and his exiled love, but 2 people working toward a common goal. He held a branch aside for her, his hand brushing hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through both of them. It was the first time they had touched in 21 years. Elara pulled her hand back as if burned, her heart hammering. Kaelin froze, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes held a universe of regret. He remembered a time when touching her was as natural as breathing. He remembered the feel of her fingers laced with his as they walked the moonlit gardens of the spire. He remembered tracing the line of her jaw, the warmth of her skin under his cool touch, a contrast that had always fascinated him. He had been so careful with her, a creature of immense strength terrified of breaking this beautiful, fragile, mortal thing. He had not realized then that she was far stronger than he was. The night we met, he said, his voice low, almost lost in the sound of the rain. "You were not afraid of me." Elara finished gathering the sap before she answered, her back still to him. "I was terrified," she admitted softly. "But you looked lonely. I had never seen anyone look so lonely before. I was more curious than I was afraid." "Loneliness is the natural state of my kind," he said, the words an old, tired truth. "No," she said, finally turning to face him. "Loneliness is a choice. You had a choice, Kaelin. You could have chosen not to be lonely. You chose a crown instead." The truth of her words hung between them, stark and undeniable. Before he could form a reply, a howl echoed through the dead woods, a sound of splintering wood and ancient rage. Liam and Rhys, who had been scouting ahead, came running back. Two of them, Rhys panted, his hand gripping the hilt of his new sword. "Bigger than the first one. They're guarding the clearing." Kaelin's focus snapped back to the present. The brief moment of connection was over, shattered by the encroaching danger. He looked at Elara, at the weapon in her hands, at the grim set of her jaw. He saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, the same fierce courage he had fallen in love with. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice once again that of the king, the commander. But she shook her head, planting the butt of her polearm firmly in the mud. "We do this together. Or not at all." He looked from her to Liam, who stood ready with his axe, then to Rhys, who nodded in agreement with his mother. He was outnumbered. For the first time in centuries, the King of the Spire was not the sole authority. He was part of an alliance, a fellowship forged of desperation and a complicated, painful love. He gave a single, sharp nod. Together. The clearing was worse than before. The waystone pulsed with a malevolent violet light that cast the entire area in a ghastly, unnatural glow. Two guardians, larger and more twisted than the first, stood sentinel before it. They were hulking brutes of dead wood and blighted root, their forms vaguely resembling bears or great wolves, their heads burning with the same violet fire. There was no time for a plan. The guardians charged the moment they entered the clearing. "Rhys, the stone, now!" Kaelin yelled, and then he was a blur of motion, a shadow of death intercepting the first creature. His fists, hard as granite, slammed into its wooden hide, staggering it. But the creature was immensely strong, and its claws, like sharpened branches, tore through Kaelin's fine coat, leaving deep gouges in the immortal flesh beneath. Liam met the second guardian with a roar, his axe swinging in a glittering arc. The blade bit deep into the creature's shoulder, and it shrieked, the sound of 1,000 trees falling at once. It swiped at him, and Liam, though strong, was no match for its supernatural speed. He stumbled back, raising his axe to parry, but the blow would have crushed him. Suddenly, Elara was there. She thrust her polearm forward, the sharp hook catching the creature's arm and deflecting the blow. The monster turned its attention to her, its burning eye sockets fixing on this new threat. Rhys watched the chaos for a half-second, torn between his duty and his instinct to protect his family. He saw his mother, brave and terrified, standing against a nightmare. He saw Liam, bleeding from a cut on his arm but holding his ground. He saw the Vampire King, the monster from his past, fighting with a silent, deadly grace to keep a horror at bay. They were all fighting for him. He turned and ran for the stone. The hum of its power grew deafening as he approached, a physical pressure against his skull. The air was ice-cold, and the violet light seemed to suck the very warmth from his body. He reached the base of the monolith and pressed his hands against its cold, vibrating surface. Pain. It was immediate and absolute. It felt like his veins were filled with shards of ice. The stone's corrupting energy flooded into him, trying to overwhelm him, to snuff out his life. He cried out, his knees buckling. "Rhys!" Elara screamed, seeing him falter. She jabbed her weapon at the guardian, creating a momentary opening for Liam, who swung his axe again, severing one of the creature's legs. It howled and stumbled. Kaelin, meanwhile, was locked in a deadly dance with his opponent. He was faster, but the creature was relentless, and every blow it landed took a visible toll, his healing slowing with each wound. He saw Rhys on the ground and a new, desperate strength filled him. He would not fail him again. He would not watch his son die. Rhys lay at the foot of the stone, the blight's cold seeping into him. He was losing. He felt his own warmth, his life force, being extinguished. He was going to die. Focus, Kaelin's voice echoed in his memory. Find the warmth. The part of you that is your mother's son. He thought of her. He thought of her face when she smiled, the feel of her hand on his forehead when he was sick as a child. He thought of her quiet strength, the resilience that had carried them through everything. Then he thought of Liam. He thought of the steady, patient way Liam had taught him his trade, the pride in his eyes when Rhys had forged his first perfect horseshoe. He thought of their quiet companionship, a bond forged not in blood, but in love and respect. This was his anchor. This was his truth. He was not a king's heir. He was Alara's son. He was Liam's son. A new strength, born of that love, surged through him. He pushed back against the cold, not with the pale, gentle light from before, but with a fierce, burning golden fire. He got to his feet, his hands still pressed against the stone, and he roared his defiance. The golden light erupted from him, pouring into the waystone. The violet veins flickered, sizzled, and began to recede. The keening hum of the stone changed pitch, becoming a pure, clear note. As the corruption was driven from the stone, the two guardians convulsed. They began to fall apart, not into loam this time, but into grey, lifeless dust, their power source severed. Kaelin, bleeding from a dozen wounds, stumbled back. Liam and Alara rushed to Rhys's side as the golden light faded, and he collapsed, his energy spent. The clearing was silent. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by the clean, damp smell of rain on earth. The waystone no longer pulsed with violet light, it was now just a simple, black stone, crisscrossed with newly formed veins of glittering gold. Rhys lay on the ground, pale and still, but breathing. He had done it. He had cleansed the heart of the valley. Kaelin watched as Alara cradled their son's head in her lap, whispering his name, her touch gentle and loving. He watched as Liam knelt beside them, checking Rhys for injuries, his expression one of profound relief and fatherly concern. They were a perfect, self-contained unit. A family. He stood apart, covered in blood and dirt, an outsider. He had fought beside them, bled for them, but he was not one of them. The battle was won, but his own, private war, the war for a place in his son's life, felt utterly, hopelessly lost. The aftermath was quiet. The rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the canopy of the now healing woods. On the walk back to the village, green shoots were already visible, pushing their way through the grey dust. Life was returning to the Whisperwood, resilient and determined. Rhys was weak but conscious, leaning heavily on Liam's sturdy shoulder. Alara walked on his other side, her hand never far from his arm, her face etched with a weary relief. Kaelin followed a few paces behind, a solitary shadow trailing the small, tight-knit family. The wounds on his body were closing, his immortal flesh knitting itself back together, but the wound in his soul remained wide and weeping. He had seen the truth in the clearing. His son's power was not rooted in his vampiric blood, in the legacy of the Obsidian Throne. It was rooted in his humanity, in the love he felt for the people who had raised him. It was a power Kaelin could never grant him, and could never truly understand. They reached the edge of the village as dusk was beginning to settle. The warm lights of the cottages seemed brighter now, more welcoming. The air no longer carried the scent of dread, but the familiar, comforting smells of home. The threat was gone. And with its departure, Kaelin's purpose in this place was fulfilled. There was no longer any reason for him to stay. He stopped at the edge of the woods, watching them walk toward their cottage. Rhys paused and looked back at him. Their eyes met across the growing distance. There was no longer anger in the young man's gaze, nor the coldness of a stranger. There was something else, something more complex, a grudging respect, a hint of curiosity, and a deep, unbridgeable distance. Rhys gave him a short, formal nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of invitation. Then he turned and continued on, disappearing into the warm light of his home. The door closed, and Kaelin was alone again. It was a familiar state, but it had never felt so profound, so absolute. He had come here to reclaim a part of himself, to right an ancient wrong. But the past could not be reclaimed. It could only be acknowledged. He had not earned a son. He had simply met him. He turned and began the long walk back to the abandoned mill, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. He spent the night there, not resting, but thinking. He looked back over the centuries of his existence, a long, unbroken line of power, duty, and suffocating loneliness. He had upheld the law, preserved his kingdom, honored his ancestors. And in doing so, he had become a hollow thing, a king of dust and echoes. Ilara had been right. Loneliness was a choice. And he had chosen it, again and again. At dawn, he went to the cottage. He did not go to the door. He waited by the low stone wall where he had spoken with Ilara, a silent supplicant. It was she who emerged first, carrying a basket for her herb garden. She saw him and stopped, her expression unreadable. "You are leaving," she stated. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "My purpose here is done." "And your kingdom?" she asked, a faint edge to her voice. "Is it safe now?" "For now," he said. "Thanks to your son." He paused, gathering the words he had needed to say for 21 years. "I came here to use him, Ilara. I told myself it was for the good of my people, to save them from a plague. But it was for me. I wanted to see him. I wanted a second chance. I did not deserve 1 inch." He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all artifice. "I am sorry. For leaving you. For letting them send you away. For failing you, and for failing him. It was not the law that made me weak. It was fear. I was a coward. You said it yourself, and you were right." The apology, so long in coming, hung in the crisp morning air. It was not grand or poetic. It was simple, unadorned, and painfully honest. Ilara listened, her grip tightening on her basket. She saw in his eyes not the arrogant king, but the lonely man she had once glimpsed, a man trapped in a prison of his own making. Forgiveness was a mountain she was not yet ready to climb, but for the first time, she saw a path at its base. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice softer. "I will go back to my cold stone halls," he said. "But I will not rule as I did before. The law that exiled you, it will be broken. I will shatter it. My counsel will not be pleased." A rare, faint smile touched his lips. It is long past time they were displeased. From the cottage, Rhys and Liam emerged. They saw Kaelin and stopped, their expressions wary. Kaelin turned his attention to his son. "Rhys," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "You have a great power within you. A power for life. It is a gift from your mother. Do not let the shadow in your blood extinguish it." He reached into his coat and produced the leather-bound book he had offered before. This time, he did not offer it as a command or a right. He simply placed it on the stone wall between them. "This is not a command," he said, his eyes on Rhys. "It is a choice. Should you ever wish to know more about the other half of your heritage, the stories are there. Should you ever wish to see the lands of your father, the way will be open to you. There is a place for you in my world, if you should ever choose to seek it. But your home is here." He looked at Liam, a long, searching look that passed between the two fathers. It was a look of acknowledgement, of respect. Kaelin, the immortal king, inclined his head to the mortal blacksmith in a gesture of profound deference. He was ceding his claim, admitting defeat, and in doing so, finding a strange, quiet peace. Without another word, he turned and walked away. He did not look back. He melted into the morning mist of the forest, a creature of shadow returning to his domain. The three of them stood there for a long time, watching the spot where he had vanished. The air felt lighter, the world brighter. The ghost that had haunted them was finally gone, not vanquished, but released. Rhys walked to the stone wall and picked up the book. He traced the silver sigil, his expression thoughtful. He did not open it. Not yet. He looked at Ilara, and then at Liam, the two pillars of his world. "Come on," Liam said, clapping him on the back, his voice thick with emotion. "There's a plowshare in the forge that won't hammer itself. And your mother promised us honey cakes for breakfast." Rhys smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He tucked the book under his arm and turned his back on the whisperwood. He walked with his family toward the cottage, toward the smell of wood smoke and baking, toward the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the forge. He was a boy of two worlds, a son of two fathers, an heir to two kingdoms. But as he stepped over the threshold into the warmth and light of his home, he knew, with an unshakable certainty, which